Okay, don't judge me, okay? I'm working on the background. It's currently on pause. Something came in between. But I think sometimes something is equally as beautiful when it's left unfinished than if it was finished. Similar to the Mona Lisa, which is arguably one of the most famous paintings out there, it was never finished. Even though Leonardo da Vinci filled up the entire canvas, he passed away before he could publish it. And there are many theories as to why, or what was left unfinished. My favorite one is that he never really figured out the eyebrow portion of the painting, because I don't know why she doesn't have eyebrows. Doesn't this also kind of explain this mysterious smile that everybody talks about? The bitch doesn't have eyebrows. Of course she looks a bit weird. Anyway, I went out there and looked for paintings that were left unfinished yet still became popular. Or maybe became popular because they were left unfinished. For example, Gilbert Stuart was the most famous portraitist of 1796, and he painted a portrait of George Washington. Now, George Washington wasn't the type of guy to sit down for a portrait, but his wife liked this portrait so much she requested that he would sit for one more portrait. Just one more. Under the sole condition that when it was finished, it would be hers and hers alone. Washington agreed. The painting was only gonna be for his wife, right? So he sat down and did one more portrait. And in the process of painting this portrait, Gilbert Stuart became in love with what he was doing. He wanted to keep the painting, but he already had this deal with Martha Washington. What was he gonna do? He figured, well, the deal was only to give it to her once the painting was finished. So if I never finish it, she doesn't get it, and I can keep it. And that's kind of what happened. Martha Washington never got the painting. And Gilbert Stuart, after the death of George Washington a few years later, made quite a few copies. So many copies even that currently there are around 11 billion of these copies floating around. Now you might be thinking, I'm silly, right? That number is way too huge. He's exaggerating. But I'm not. Because this painting is actually used as a reference for the $1 bill. Now, how's that for a change? George Washington didn't want this painting to be given to anybody else but his wife, so we decided to just make it the $1 bill. Probably the most occurring dollar bill that's out there. Based on a painting that was supposed to be only for his loving wife. Or how about this one? It's called the Treaty of Paris by Benjamin West. A huge moment in the history of the United States of America. It signals the end of the Revolutionary War. And Benjamin West wanted to paint this iconic moment. So in 1783, the Americans John Jay, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Henry Lawrence and William Temple Franklin sat down to pose for a painting in which they signed the Treaty of Paris. So why was this painting never finished? It's such an iconic moment in the history, why would you abandon the project? Well, Benjamin West forgot one really important part of the painting process. The British really didn't care for this iconic moment in the history of a land they just lost. So they just didn't show up to painting day, and Benjamin West couldn't finish the painting. Now even though this painting was forcibly unfinished, I still think it's maybe equally iconic. Similar to my white background. It's completely plain. No? Iconic. The next unfinished painting is called The Unfinished Portrait. And you'll never guess, but it is a portrait left unfinished. In 1945, Elizabeth Shumatov sat down to paint a portrait of the President of the United States of America at that time, who was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, by the way, is the only president to have served 3 terms in office. So who knows? Trump might figure it out. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the president who dealt with the Great Depression, and he now was in the final stages of the Second World War. So much responsibility during such a hard time has to wear on a man, and the health of the president was deteriorating. A picture was taken a day prior for the painter to use as reference, and you can see just how wary the president has become. But on the morning of the 12th of April, the president came in for a painting session. He complained at the start that he was having a bit of a headache, but as the painting went on, he was feeling better and better. By noon, they got the message that lunch would be served soon, so the president told Elizabeth that she would have to finish the painting quickly. At least she would still have the reference to use to finish it after all. A few minutes later, the president complained. The headache that he had at the start of the day was coming back, and it was getting worse and worse. And all of a sudden, the president slumped over forwards. And he never got back up. President Roosevelt had died while sitting for a portrait, which means that the last seconds of his life were expressed in his portrait. So yes, this painting is unfinished, but tell me that this is not more powerful than if the artist would have finished it based on a photograph. 1 year later, another painting was started but never finished, and it is one by Piet Mondrian. You know, the squares guy. The art where everyone looks at it and some part inside of you goes like, I could do that. Well, Piet is a Dutch painter who fled to America when World War II broke out. But in 1944, when he heard Holland was liberated, he was so overjoyed he started painting vigorously. Oh, he painted a square here, a square there, and it became known as the Victory Boogie Woogie. The man who was probably obsessed that the other guy who was taking over his country was rocking the same stash as him loved to boogie woogie. He actually loved it so much that he dedicated 2 paintings towards it. The first one is called the Broadway Boogie Woogie, but the second one is called the Victory Boogie Woogie, and he unfortunately wasn't able to finish it. The painting is supposed to be interpreted as the colors and squares dancing off the canvas, and whoo, it's so happy, and I guess you're about to boogie woogie yourself. But for some reason I just can't really shake the feeling that it looks like a static TV screen. I mean, what part is even unfinished? For the life of me, I wouldn't know what part is filled in and what is not. I'm sorry, Pete, but come on, it's hard to understand the squares. At least in the next painting you can clearly see what part is done and which part is left unfinished. It's called James Hunter Black Draftee by Alice Neel. Now Alice Neel often did portraits of random people, and one day I guess James Hunter was passing by and Alice Neel asked him to sit down. This was in 1965. James Hunter had just found out that he was being drafted for the Vietnam War. I cannot imagine how you'd feel walking down the streets after finding out that you've been sent off to die, basically. But James Hunter decided to sit down, and during their first session Alice Neel was only able to draw the outlines of his body, but luckily for us also capture the expression on his face. One can only imagine that sitting for such a long time with your own emotions, contemplating the faith that has been bestowed upon you, makes you wonder if it's all fair and if it's really worth it. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to James Hunter. James never returned for a second session. We do know that his name didn't show up on the Veteran Memorial for Vietnam, so unless he used an alias, we can say with kind of certainty that he didn't die in Vietnam. But there's also just a decent chance that he didn't go. Tell me it's not likely that he was sitting there like, yo, what the fuck? Fuck this shit, man. Now if you were watching this and you're like, man, that was decent. That was decent, but it should be better before I subscribe. Now I get that argument, but hear me out. If you subscribe, it motivates me to improve. So if you think it should be better, you should subscribe. Now if you think it's good enough to subscribe, you should also basically I'm saying subscribe, you know? Thanks.